Heyo YouTube, Flocat here, and welcome to the video. Today, we are going to be discussing team building with Dehya. Now, I have seen quite a few videos covering Dehya and her kit and all sorts of wonderful things from many great content creators. But unfortunately, I have a feeling that because people are generally disappointed with Dehya, they are not really giving her a fair shake. And what I mean by that is, I see a lot of team synergies that I have not seen many other people show. So I wanted to go ahead and show you guys some interesting teams that I've been using with Dehya that I find to be pretty fun and effective. As well, I wanted to discuss basic team building with Dehya, just to give you guys some tips for when you're building your own teams for Dehya. Now, I'm showcasing these teams because they have specific synergies that I think are cool with Dehya, and you do not have to run these exact teams. I'm sure that as you're watching, you'll be able to figure out like, oh, I could sub in this unit for that unit. For instance, anytime I run Kokomi, you could just swap in Barbara. So obviously I prefer Kokomi. She's a better option in my opinion, and obviously is just a better option. But you know, if you don't have Kokomi, Barbara is also an option that you can run with Dehya. Is gonna sound kind of obvious to some, but I just need to say this. Dehya is not a hyper carry. I see a lot of people basing her utility and her strength and her overall value on whether or not she can carry the entire team with her damage in her 4-second burst window. Frankly, I think this is ridiculous. Clearly, Dehya is meant to take up very little field time, and she's meant to enable your teams to deal more damage as well as provide protective utility. But because Dehya is not a hyper carry, trying to build an entire team around her 4-second burst window, it's just not going to cut it no matter how you slice it. So instead, what I would recommend doing is focusing on her burst being the very end of the rotation before you set up for your next rotation, and the rest of the rotation I would try to use her skill to enable as many reactions as possible with your other units driving the elemental application. Alright, so enough chitter chatter, let's go ahead and jump into the team building section and discuss a couple, well, 6 specific teams, and I'll go over the synergies that make these teams work so well. We're going to start out with an incredibly simple team, but it's kind of a high investment team as well. They're all 5 stars.
Bruh.
We have Yae Miko, Kokomi, Mona, and Dehya. Now, it's obvious this is an overvape team. You are using the totems plus a lot of hydro application to make sure that there's always electro and hydro on the enemies. And that means that every time you go to cast Dehya's skill, or every time it procs, there will be a vape, and quite possibly, or probably, an overvape, which is when you have a vape and an overload proc at the same time. This is a pretty potent combination, and I particularly enjoy this team because you can quick swap between Mona and Kokomi and you'll always have that hydro application. So sometimes I like to have Kokomi on field for her burst for quick healing, but sometimes if the pyro application overtakes the enemy or something like that, I can swap over to Mona and do a really quick charge attack for like a nice juicy vape. I just really enjoy this team for its simplicity, its ease of use, and it's a really good introduction to quick swap teams if you're not very familiar with them, because it's hard to go wrong when you're playing this team. Other than that, the only thing to keep in mind is that you want to burst with Yae Miko sometime during your rotation and put down your turrets again just for some extra damage. The next team, which I have very little footage of, so I apologize for the lack of B-roll. My Dehya is not really built for Burgeon, although she does have about 300 elemental mastery, so it's not worthless. This team is really cool because it's like an over-vape Burgeon team, where essentially you're using her skill to boost up the damage of Kamisato Ayato while he's proccing, you know, Bloom, and you got some hyper blooms and some overloads. It's sort of just like a mess of a reaction team, but it works really well. If you notice a lot of dendro cores laying around, you can swap into Dehya and tap her skill just for a really quick juicy Burgeon, and that's very nice. But yeah, this team is also pretty simple, and it's very, very fun. I would recommend swapping Nahida for DMC, Dendro main character, if you're playing wave-based combat. But because this is a quick swap team and Ayato doesn't really take that much field time, Nahida having to take field to reapply her mark doesn't really matter as much as it does in like a team with like Sino, who's got a bunch of field time. All right, so next up is a team that is actually rather complicated and takes a little bit of know-how when it comes to elemental application. But if you have that knowledge, then you can pull off some powerful reactions with this team. The basic idea is that you're gonna start out with Diona, apply a bunch of cryo and pop her burst for extra EM, healing, all that great stuff. And then you're gonna swap to Dehya and do some quick melts. Now, because Diona's cryo application is really poor, it's very easy for Dehya to overtake Diona's cryo application to leave a pyro aura on the enemy. So after you're done with your quick melt at the beginning of the rotation, you will have pyro aura on the enemy, and you can use Candace for some juicy skill vapes, after which you can proc her burst, and then you can put down Mona's skill, and then you can either be on field with either Candace or Dehya, and you can just stand there and wail on the enemies while Dehya's skill consistently procs vapes. Now again, this team is pretty complicated when it comes to rotations, and I would not recommend this team for someone who's unfamiliar with the elemental reaction system and how to utilize reactions to the best of your ability. But if you are comfortable with complicated rotations and you want to try out a fun and interesting team that uses supports that you might not be using for really anyone else, this is a really cool team. I love seeing the big vapes from Candace, just with her skill hitting like 50, 60k. It's pretty nice. Gotta love to see it. Next up is actually my favorite Dehya team right now, mostly because Sara is in the team, if I'm being totally honest with you. But we obviously have Kokomi, Mona, Sara, and Dehya. Now, Kokomi and Mona are there for the hydro application, of course. This is an overvape team. So in overvape teams, you want to make sure that you have extremely consistent application with your hydro to make sure that you're always able to set up these overvapes. Now, there are a couple things that I like about Sara in this team. Because her elemental application is kind of slow, you can have hydro on your enemies from Kokomi and Mona, and then you can proc Sara's skill, immediately swap over and use Dehya's skill. You'll get a vape, you'll get the buff from Sara, and you'll get an overload. I really like this 1-2 punch kind of play style where you just have your hydro going and you're just swapping between Sara and Dehya to buff and do damage. Now, I will say you can use Sara's buff on Dehya for Dehya's burst, but you gotta be careful not to proc Electro Charge on Mona's burst, or else you'll kind of mess up the vaping potential for Dehya. So what I really recommend doing is kind of running away from the enemy, tapping Sara's skill, going into your Dehya, grabbing the buff, then swap to Mona, use her burst, and then use your burst with Dehya. And you should still have pretty much the buff the entire time for your Dehya during her burst, and it'll make sure you don't mess up your elemental reactions for Mona. All right, so next up is my melt team for Dehya. Now you'll notice there's no hydro here. I highly recommend doing double cryo Animo Dehya. And particularly, I have a highly invested Shenhe and a Chongyun, so I'm using them as well as my Jean to have this really fun team. So I found with Chongyun and Shenhe, I'm able to provide enough cryo application for my Dehya to consistently melt all the time. And then for me particularly, the attack speed from Jean C2, the cooldown reduction from Chongyun C2, as well as the attack speed from Chongyun while in his field, are all very nice buffs that make this team feel a lot smoother in terms of rotations to play. And the last team that I want to show you guys is another overvape team, but in this team specifically, we've got Kuki, Mona, Dehya, and Ayato. Now this team is really easy to use, and I highly recommend this team if you just want something easy that you can kind of plug and play. Doesn't take too much brain power. The rotation is you use Kuki's skill, you use Mona's skill, Dehya's skill, and then you go right into Ayato's skill, and you start applying so much hydro that when Dehya's skill procs, it will proc an overvape because you'll have some electrocharge going on. And yeah, it's just a very nice boost to Ayato's damage while he's on field, as well as providing that defensive utility to keep him alive. Now, of course, if you have your Ayato built with plenty of energy recharge, you're going to want to use his burst first and then go into his skill. As soon as Ayato is done doing his slashes, you want to pop back over to Dehya, use her skill recast to get another juicy vape, and then you pretty much just Mona burst, Dehya burst, and reset. It's a pretty simple rotation, it's pretty easy to use, and it's a fun team. Now at this point, you might have noticed that most of the vape teams that I recommended were over vape teams, and I really didn't recommend many just raw vape teams. There's a reason for this. Dehya's damage heavily depends on the amount of reactions that she can pull off in a rotation. And so the way I approach it is every time you do a vape reaction, you could also be doing an overload reaction and get an extra 6,000 to 8,000 damage for free, just on top. So if I'm hitting like 25,000 on my vape for my skill cast, and I get an extra 8,000 damage, that takes me about over 30,000 damage for, just casting her skill. That being said, overvape teams can be more complicated than normal vape teams, and they can sometimes require a little more finesse. So sometimes just the raw vape teams are more appealing. But to be totally honest with you, I think that Dehya shines the best in overvape as well as Burgeon. And as a matter of fact, you'll even notice that the Burgeon team itself has elements of an overvape team within it because it's just so good for her. I want to discuss just a couple team building tips that I found extremely useful when putting together teams for Dehya. The first tip that I'd like to bring up is that Dehya's burst and the cast of her skill will shatter. So if you plan on running her as like a solo pyro unit in a freeze team to do all those juicy melts, you'll notice that when you use her burst, or when you cast her skill, not when it procs, but when you initially cast it, it will cause a shatter reaction. Now, as some of you may be aware, shatter is a particularly weak reaction at this point in Genshin Impact, and I kind of don't think they're really gonna buff it at all, but essentially, it makes it so that you can't melt a hit that you shatter. When you proc shatter, it destroys the cryo aura around the enemy. And oftentimes the cryo aura also consumes the hydro aura, so you're left with nothing. So if you're going to run her in a freeze team, it might be best to use her burst when there's no cryo on the field and it's just hydro. That is one way around it. And you can also cast her skill when enemies aren't frozen and have no cryo on them to get vapes. So there are limited synergies with freeze teams, but honestly, if you want to melt with your Dehya, I would just recommend running double cryo with like an Animo unit. And from that point on, if you're not using her burst and you're not casting her skill, if the enemies are frozen, they will melt when her skill procs while you're attacking. Tip number 2 is that pyro application for Dehya is very consistent, but it's slower than some other units you might be used to, like Zhongling. What's great about this is that Dehya needs less consistent elemental application to be able to react any hit that can react. For this reason, I recommend playing around with your roster and seeing what kind of units apply enough element for you to be able to keep up and react with your Dehya. I think this is really important because Dehya's raw damage is not the best. Kind of like Zhongling, her raw damage isn't the best. But as soon as you start adding in elemental reactions, it boosts her potential by a lot. The next tip is that Viridescent Venerer is not needed for Dehya in basically any of her teams. I would not recommend trying to shred the pyro resistances for Dehya using Viridescent Venerer because most of the time the buff is so short-lived that it's not really worth it. It can be helpful for buffing up her burst, but overall I find that just using Mona is significantly easier and way better for team building than trying to slot in a Viridescent user. Now you can still use Animo when team building with Dehya. I just wouldn't recommend trying to build the whole team around shredding pyro resistances to vape with your Dehya, because the setup just takes so long and it's not really worth the payoff you're going to get for Dehya. Instead, it's better just to focus on consistently reacting every single hit and go from there. All right, so that's going to be 6 teams that I've been playing around with my Dehya. Teams that I find to be pretty fun, engaging, interesting, whatever, and rather effective as well. Mona is clearly her best support for right now. Her buff lasts the perfect amount of duration for Dehya's burst, as well as Mona providing a lot of hydro application that you need for your Dehya. Also, I tend to run double hydro teams. My Dehya is C2R1, so I like the little bit of HP boost that I get from the double hydro. So often I'm running Mona plus Kokomi, or Mona plus Candace, or Mona plus really any other hydro unit to get that hydro resonance buff. If Dehya needed Xingqiu and Yelan and Benny and just all the supports that we're already using for every other team, then, I mean, honestly, it would just be kind of more demand and less supply. To me, the fact that she has access to some unique synergies and also has the ability to use supports that I'm not really using in any other team is highly valuable for my account. But I think the way Dehya's kit is designed is set up really well for some current synergies, but also for future synergies. She doesn't need as much elemental application to be able to react as some other pyro units, so even if future units don't provide buckets of hydro or buckets of cryo, we could still be able to use them for Dehya, even if they don't work for some units like Hu Tao or Zhongling, because their pyro application is intense. But yeah, that's pretty much all I got for you today. If you have Dehya and you've been enjoying using certain teams with her, make sure you put those teams in the comments down below and help grow my knowledge of Dehya team building. If you liked the video, make sure to drop a like on it. And as well, if you wouldn't mind subscribing for future Genshin Impact content, that would be lovely. Make sure you join that Discord. We give away Welkin moons. Lovely. Like the video if you like it, subscribe if you want more Genshin Impact content in the future. I do about 2 Genshin Impact streams a week, as well as weekly video releases. So if that's something that interests you, if a friendly, non-crazy hyperbolic community interests you, make sure you join the Discord, make sure you get involved, and until next time, stay healthy, stay hydrated. Peace.